The Lorraine countryside drowned in gray September fog as the steel column of the 111th Panzer Brigade advanced toward the undefended American positions at Aricourt. High above, Major Charles Carpenter banked his L-4H Grasshopper and caught the glint of sloped German Panther armor. Their guns could kill Shermans from 1,000 yards away, while his spotter plane, jury-rigged with 6 bazookas, was never meant for combat. Gripping the trembling control stick, the former history teacher locked his gaze on the slow-moving target below. He sent the fragile machine into a shallow dive, calculating an angle that violated every regulation he'd been taught. The road from a classroom in Illinois to the cockpit of a modified spotter plane over France had been a long one. I lived with this story while writing it, and now it's yours. The complete version is linked in the description. Make sure you're subscribed, grab your headphones, and let's go on this journey together. The September sky over Lorraine hung low and gray, pregnant with the threat of rain that seemed to follow the Third Army wherever it went. Major Charles Carpenter banked his L-4H Grasshopper into a gentle turn, the 65-horsepower Continental engine thrumming steadily as he crossed over another patchwork of fields and hedgerows. Below him, the French countryside rolled out in soft undulations. Farming villages with their terracotta roofs, stands of oak and beech beginning to turn with autumn's touch, the occasional plume of smoke marking where artillery had found its range. The war had moved fast since Normandy. Too fast, some said. The logistics couldn't keep up with Patton's pace, and now the Third Army sat astride the Moselle with its fuel tanks half empty and its supply lines stretched thin as piano wire. But the momentum had carried them this far, and Carpenter could see its evidence everywhere. Burnt-out German vehicles pushed into ditches, white surrender flags hanging limp from farmhouse windows, columns of prisoners trudging west under guard. He leveled out at 1,200 feet, eyes scanning the terrain ahead where Combat Command A had pushed beyond Aricourt. The Grasshopper responded to his touch like a living thing, docile and forgiving. With its fabric-covered frame and high-wing configuration, it was never meant for combat. The whole aircraft weighed less than 1,000 pounds, empty. A strong man could tip it on its nose. Yet here it was, day after day, nosing over German positions while Carpenter called corrections to the artillery batteries, directing shells onto targets he could see, but they could not. It should have been enough. It was what he'd trained for, what the Army expected from its observation pilots. Spot, report, adjust fire, return. Rinse and repeat until the sun went down or the weather closed in. Safe work, relatively speaking. The Germans rarely bothered with the Cubs. They had bigger concerns than a lone spotter plane puttering overhead. But it gnawed at him. Carpenter had been a history teacher before the war, standing in front of classrooms in Moline, Illinois, talking about Gettysburg and Antietam, about men who'd made choices in moments that mattered. He'd married Elda in '41, watched her hold their daughter Carol with tears streaming down her face the day he left for training. He'd promised to come back. He intended to keep that promise. But he also intended to do more than just watch. The idea had come from other L-4 pilots who'd started mounting bazookas under their wings, crude installations, jury-rigged in the field with whatever materials came to hand. When Carpenter saw his first bazooka-armed Cub, something clicked into place. The L-4H could carry 232 pounds beyond the pilot's weight, assuming no radio aboard. 6 M1 bazookas weighed about 78 pounds. 6 rockets added more, but not much. The math worked. Barely. He'd gotten permission from his CO, who'd looked at him like he'd suggested flying the Grasshopper to Berlin. But permission was permission. The ground crew had done the actual work, mounting 3 launch tubes under each wing strut, running the electrical firing wires into the cockpit, where Carpenter could trigger them with switches mounted near the throttle. They'd painted the nose art themselves. Rosie the Rocketer. A play on Rosie the Riveter, the girl from the posters back home who reminded everyone that women were doing their part too. The first test firing had nearly scared Carpenter out of his seat. The whoosh and flame, the sudden lurch as the rocket motor ignited and the projectile tore away from its tube. The Grasshopper had bucked like a spooked horse, but it had worked. 6 shots at armor from above, where the tanks were weakest. 6 chances to do something more than observe. Now, 3 weeks into September, Carpenter flew his modified bird over the bulge where the 4th Armored Division pushed toward the German frontier. Intelligence said the enemy was falling back, disorganized and demoralized. But intelligence also said there were new Panzer brigades forming up, fresh tanks with green crews being thrown into the gap to slow Patton's advance. Carpenter had seen the signs himself. Increased movement at night, fresh track marks in the mud, the occasional glint of armor tucked into tree lines that hadn't been there the day before. He pulled a slow circle over Aracourt, noting the positions of friendly armor. The Shermans looked like toys from this altitude, arranged in hull-down positions along the low ridges. Colonel Bruce Clark's Combat Command A had done well getting this far, but they were exposed now, stretched out ahead of the main body. If the Germans counterattacked here, it would hurt. The radio crackled, static mostly, but beneath it, the steady chatter of units checking in, calling for fire missions, reporting all quiet on their sectors. Carpenter didn't carry a radio operator anymore. The weight of the bazookas made that impossible. He flew alone, which suited him fine. Fewer people to worry about when things went sideways. And things would go sideways. He could feel it in the air, in the way the German artillery had gone quiet over the past 2 days, in the reports filtering back about movement beyond the front lines. The calm before the storm, his grandfather would have called it. That moment when the pressure builds and builds until something has to give. Carpenter turned the Grasshopper south, following the road toward Nancy. The light was fading now, the September afternoon giving way to evening. He'd need to get back soon, refuel, check the bazooka mounts for the 100th time, make sure the electrical connections were solid. Tomorrow would come early. Tomorrow always did. Below him, American soldiers dug their foxholes deeper and checked their ammunition. They didn't know what was coming any more than he did. But they'd be ready. They'd have to be. And when the German tanks rolled forward, because they would, Carpenter was certain of that now. He'd be up here waiting for them, not just watching anymore, not just calling in coordinates and hoping someone else did the work. This time, he'd strike first. The teacher from Illinois, who'd never fired a shot in anger, was gone. In his place sat a man with 6 rockets slung beneath a fabric-covered wing, hunting for targets in the gathering dusk. The pre-dawn darkness over Aracourt carried the damp chill of late September, that peculiar cold that seeps through wool and canvas and settles in the bones. Carpenter stood beside Rosie the Rocketer on the makeshift airstrip, a cleared pasture that had been French farmland until the 4th Armored Division requisitioned it 3 days prior. The grass was still there, trampled flat by boots and tire treads, slick with dew that would burn off once the sun climbed high enough to matter. He ran his hand along the fuselage, fingers tracing the fabric stretched taut over the steel frame. The nose art caught what little light the moon offered. Rosie in her bandana and work shirt, wielding a rocket instead of a rivet gun. Someone from the ground crew had added a small detail Carpenter hadn't noticed before. Tiny German crosses painted beneath the cockpit sill. Kill markers. Optimistic, maybe, or prophetic. The 6 bazookas hung beneath the wings like strange fruit. 3 per side, their launch tubes angled slightly downward. Carpenter had checked them twice already, but he checked them again now, tugging on each mount, testing the electrical connections that ran from the tubes into the cockpit. The M6A3 rockets sat snug in their launchers, warheads forward, fins aft. Each one could punch through 4 inches of armor plate, enough to crack open a Panzer IV from the top. Maybe even a Panther if he got lucky with the angle. You're gonna wear the wings off that bird if you keep fussing. Carpenter turned. Sergeant Bill Morrison stood a few yards away, a cigarette cupped in his palm to hide the glow. Morrison ran the ground crew that kept the L4s flying, patching fabric, changing oil, cursing the Continental engines when they refused to start on cold mornings. He'd mounted the bazookas himself, spent 2 days fabricating brackets and running wiring harnesses, muttering the whole time about crazy pilots and their crazy ideas. "Just making sure everything's solid," Carpenter said. "It's solid. I built it, didn't I?" Morrison took a drag, the ember flaring orange in the darkness. "You really think they're coming today?" "Intelligence says so." Intelligence said Paris would take 2 weeks. We were drinking wine at a sidewalk cafe 4 days after the breakout. Morrison flicked ash into the wet grass. What do they know? More than we do, probably. "That's a low bar, Major." Carpenter allowed himself a small smile. Morrison had that quality some NCOs possessed, the ability to speak plainly without crossing the line into insubordination. It was a gift, really. Officers who couldn't handle it didn't last long. "The artillery boys have been quiet," Carpenter said. "No fire missions yesterday evening, nothing overnight. That's not normal. Maybe the Krauts are saving their shells. Or maybe they're waiting for something bigger." Carpenter looked east, toward where the German line supposedly sat. The darkness there seemed deeper somehow, more absolute. "Clark's boys are stretched thin. If the Panthers hit us here, it's going to be close." Morrison dropped his cigarette and ground it under his boot. "You planning to stop a whole Panzer brigade with 6 rockets?" "I'm planning to do what I can. That's what worries me." Morrison pulled his field jacket tighter against the cold. "You know the other pilots think you're nuts, right? Half of them won't even fly armed. Say it makes the Cub too unstable, too heavy. They'd rather spot and call it in. That's their choice. And this is yours." Morrison nodded toward Rosie. "Just try to bring her back in one piece. I'd hate to have to write to Piper and explain how one of their Cubs got shot down playing tank hunter." "I'll do my best." "See that you do." Morrison started to walk away, then paused. "Your pre-flight checklist is on the wing strut. Weather report says fog in the valleys until 0900, clearing after that. Wind from the west at 5 knots. Good hunting, Major." "Thanks, Morrison." The sergeant disappeared into the darkness, leaving Carpenter alone with his aircraft and his thoughts. The checklist was there as promised, clipped to the strut where he could read it by flashlight. He'd done this enough times that he could run through it blind. But ritual mattered. Ritual kept you alive. He checked the fuel. Tanks full, enough for 3 hours if he didn't push it. Oil level good. Control surfaces free and responsive. Propeller secure. Ignition system functional. The bazookas got their own inspection. He climbed onto the wing strut, crouching beside each launcher, verifying the electrical leads were firmly connected, that the rockets sat properly in their tubes. The smell of metal and canvas and aviation fuel filled his nose, familiar and oddly comforting. This was his world now. This strange marriage of observation aircraft and anti-tank weaponry. This jury-rigged solution to a problem that shouldn't have existed in the first place. Behind him, the sky began to lighten. Not much, just that subtle shift from black to charcoal that meant dawn was thinking about showing up. Voices carried across the airstrip, other pilots arriving for their own pre-flight routines. Engines coughed to life in the distance. Shermans moving into position, their crews grabbing whatever breakfast they could before the day's work began. Carpenter climbed into the cockpit and settled into the seat. The instrument panel glowed faintly in the gathering light. Altimeter, airspeed indicator, engine gauges. Simple compared to the bombers and fighters. But then the L-4 had always been a simple machine. That was part of its charm. You flew it by touch and instinct, feeling the air through the stick, reading the sky through the windscreen. The firing switches sat to his right, 6 toggle switches wired in sequence. He'd labeled them 1 through 6, left wing to right, so he'd know which rocket was which. In the heat of the moment, with a Panther in his sights and flak coming up, he didn't want to have to guess. He sat there as the dawn crept closer, thinking about Elda and Carol back in Illinois, about the classroom he'd left behind, about the students who'd probably forgotten him by now. He thought about the German tank crews who were out there somewhere, drinking ersatz coffee and checking their own machines, men who had wives and children too. Men who'd joined an army that had started this whole mess, but probably hadn't asked to be here any more than he had. War made philosophers of everyone eventually, or cynics. Sometimes both. The sky turned gray, then pearl, then that washed-out blue that promised another overcast day. Fog still clung to the valleys like spilled cotton, but it would burn off. It always did. And when it did, if intelligence was right, the Panthers would come rolling through those same valleys, headed straight for Clark's exposed positions. Carpenter reached for the ignition. The Continental engine caught on the second try, settling into its steady rhythm, the propellers spinning, the whole aircraft trembling with barely contained energy. He let it warm, watching the temperature gauges climb, listening to the engine's voice for any hint of trouble. Everything sounded right. Everything felt right. He advanced the throttle slightly, feeling Rosie strain against the wheel chocks. Morrison appeared again, pulling the chocks away, giving Carpenter a thumbs up. The Major returned the gesture, then eased the Grasshopper forward, taxiing toward the far end of the pasture where he'd have room to take off into the wind. The fog was lifting now, shredding into wisps and streamers. Perfect timing. Carpenter turned the nose into the wind and pushed the throttle forward. The engine roared. Well, roared as much as 65 horses could manage. And Rosie the rocketer began her roll, picking up speed, the tail coming up, the wheels leaving the wet grass behind as she climbed into the morning sky with her 6 rockets and her crazy pilot, hunting for the battle that everyone knew was coming. The fog broke apart like wet paper as Carpenter climbed through 800 feet. The Grasshopper's engine steady and sure beneath the cowling. Visibility opened up. Not perfect, but good enough. He could see the ridgelines now, the tree lines, the roads cutting through the Lorraine countryside like scars on old skin. And he could see the tanks. They came from the northeast, a column of dark shapes moving through the morning mist with deliberate purpose. Panthers mostly. He could tell by the long guns and the sloped armor that caught the weak sunlight and threw it back in dull gleams. Maybe 20 of them, strung out along the road in combat formation, accompanied by half-tracks and infantry that looked like ants from this altitude. The 111th Panzer Brigade, if intelligence had it right. Fresh from Germany, crews still learning their machines. But the machines themselves were first-rate. 75mm guns that could crack a Sherman at 1,000 yards. Frontal armor thick enough to bounce American shells unless you got lucky. Carpenter banked left, keeping the column in sight while he gained altitude. His hands moved automatically. Trim tab adjustment, throttle position, slight pressure on the rudder pedals to keep the turn coordinated. The bazookas added weight, but not much drag. Rosie handled almost like she always had, just a bit heavier on the controls, a bit slower to respond. Below him, The Panthers kept coming. They hadn't spotted him yet. Why would they? The L-4 was small, fabric-covered, painted in drab colors that blended with the overcast sky. Just another spotter plane, harmless as a sparrow. The Germans had learned to ignore them months ago. Waste of ammunition to shoot at something that couldn't shoot back. Except this one could. Carpenter pushed the nose over slightly, beginning a shallow dive that would bring him down to 600 feet. His heart hammered against his ribs. Not panic, just adrenaline, the body preparing itself for what came next. He'd done this before in training, firing at barrels painted to look like tanks, but barrels didn't shoot back. These would. The column continued its advance, unaware. Carpenter picked his target, third Panther in line, separated enough from the others that he'd have a clean shot, close enough to the road that there was nowhere to hide if things went wrong. The tank commander sat in the open cupola, probably enjoying the fresh air, thinking about breakfast or home or whatever tank commanders thought about when they weren't fighting. 500 feet. The Panther grew larger in Carpenter's windscreen, details resolving. The commander's field cap, the spare track links hanging on the hull, the antenna whipping back and forth as the tank rumbled forward. 400 feet. The angle was almost right. Top armor on a Panther was only 16 millimeters in places, thin enough that an M6A3 rocket with its shaped charge warhead could punch through and detonate inside, where the crew sat surrounded by ammunition and fuel. 300 feet. Carpenter's thumb found the first firing switch. He'd practiced this, knew exactly where each toggle sat without looking. Left wing, forward rocket. He steadied the Grasshopper, compensating for the light crosswind, waiting for the geometry to align. The Panther filled his vision now. Close enough that he could see the Balkenkreuz painted on the turret, the mud caked on the tracks. He flipped the switch. The rocket ignited with a sound like canvas tearing, a whoosh and roar that shook the entire airframe. Flames shot backward from the launch tube, bright even in daylight, and the warhead streaked down toward the Panther, trailing white smoke. The Grasshopper lurched hard to the left from the asymmetric thrust. Carpenter fought the controls, right rudder, stick forward and right, keeping the nose down, keeping the target in sight. The rocket hit the Panther's engine deck slightly off-center. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the tank erupted. Not an explosion, more like a violent exhalation, hatches blowing open, flame and smoke boiling out from every opening. The commander disappeared in the blast. The Panther slewed sideways, dead on its tracks, blocking the road. No time to watch. Carpenter hauled the Grasshopper into a climbing turn, throttle wide open, the Continental screaming. Tracer rounds stitched the air where he'd been 2 seconds before. Yellow-green streaks from a half-track's quad mount. Searching, probing, trying to find the thing that had just killed a 45-ton tank with a single shot. The column was reacting now. Vehicles scattered off the road into the fields. Hatches slammed shut. Gun barrels swiveled skyward. Carpenter pulled harder on the stick, climbing through 800 feet, 1,000, putting distance between himself and the ack-ack that was starting to find its range. Black puffs bloomed around the Grasshopper, shrapnel hissing past the fabric wings. His hands shook. Not fear. Well, maybe some fear, but mainly excitement. The rush of having done something impossible and lived. 1 Panther dead. 5 rockets left. He leveled out at 1,200 feet and circled back, searching for another opening. The Germans had gone to ground, spread out, making themselves harder targets. Smart. But they still had to move if they wanted to reach Aricourt. And movement meant exposure. A second Panther broke from cover, accelerating across an open field toward a tree line that would give it protection. Carpenter rolled into a dive. Steeper this time, airspeed building past 80 miles per hour. The wing fabric drummed. The bazookas sang in the slipstream. He picked the angle, compensated for the Panther's movement. waited until he could see the commander's cupola clearly. Second rocket ranged. Same violent kick, same lurch. He fired it early, leading the target, and watched the warhead arc down and strike the Panther's turret roof just behind the main gun. The shaped charge detonated. The turret rang like a bell. Smoke poured from the cupola. The Panther kept moving for another 50 yards, then stopped, crew bailing out through the hatches, running for the tree line while their tank burned behind them. More tracers, more flak. A burst of machine gun fire punched holes through the wing fabric above Carpenter's head, daylight showing through in neat rows. He jinked left, then right, then climbed again, weaving, never flying straight for more than 3 seconds. The Grasshopper was slow but maneuverable. Use that. Stay unpredictable. His breath came fast and shallow. Sweat ran down his back despite the cold. Below him, the Panzer column had stopped its advance, vehicles hulled down, waiting for the insane American in his fabric-covered death trap to either go away or get shot down. Neither was happening yet. Carpenter spotted a third target. Panzer IV this time, older model, squatter than the Panthers, trying to maneuver around the burning wrecks on the road. He set up another attack run, diving from the south with the weak sun behind him. Maybe the glare would help, maybe not. Didn't matter. He was committed now. Third rocket at 400 feet. Direct hit on the engine compartment. The Panzer IV shuddered to a stop. Smoke, but no fire. Might be a mobility kill, might not. Carpenter didn't wait to find out. He yanked the stick back and climbed, the Grasshopper protesting, engine temperature creeping up, oil pressure fluctuating. Something cracked past his ear. Close enough to feel the pressure wave, close enough to smell the cordite. A 20-millimeter round from one of the half-tracks, missing by inches. Carpenter threw the Grasshopper into a slip, losing altitude fast, trading height for speed, then pulling out just above the treetops. Branches whipped past below. He could see German infantry now, faces turned upward, rifles tracking his flight path. 3 rockets gone, 3 left. The electrical switches felt hot under his thumb. He climbed back up to 1,000 feet, circling, looking for an opening. The Germans had learned. They kept moving, kept their spacing wide, kept their anti-aircraft weapons pointed skyward. Getting another clean shot would be harder. Getting it without dying would be harder still. But Carpenter had spent 3 years teaching teenagers about Chancellorsville and Antietam, about battles where men had walked into canister fire because the mission demanded it. He'd stood in front of those classrooms and talked about courage like he understood it. Now he did. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was flying a 1,000-pound aircraft armed with rockets at a panzer brigade because somebody had to. And you were the one who'd volunteered. A Panther emerged from behind a farmhouse, turret traversing, searching for American armor. Carpenter rolled into his 4th attack, diving from the west this time, varying his approach, keeping them guessing. The Panther's commander saw him coming. Carpenter could see the man pointing, shouting into his radio. But the main gun couldn't elevate high enough, and the machine gun couldn't track fast enough. 4th rocket. The warhead struck the turret ring where armor was thinnest. The Panther's turret locked up, jammed, useless. The tank reversed frantically, trying to find cover with its mobility, but no firepower. Carpenter was already climbing, already looking for the next target. 500 feet. Flak burst to his left. Tracer rounds from multiple sources, creating a web of fire he had to navigate through. The Grasshopper jinked and weaved, fabric flapping where bullets had torn through, but the frame held. Piper built them tough. 2 rockets left. Make them count. He found his 5th target almost by accident. A Panther trying to flank around the American positions, moving fast across open ground. Bad tactics. Good opportunity. Carpenter dove again, hands steady now, fear burned away by repetition and necessity. The Panther saw him, stopped, traversed its gun skyward in desperation. Fifth rocket at 300 feet. It streaked home, hit the Panther's glacis plate at a shallow angle, and detonated. The shaped charge punched through. The Panther's ammunition cooked off in a secondary explosion that lifted the entire turret off its mount and dropped it 10 feet away. One rocket left, one shot. The Germans were pulling back now, moving away from the killing ground, putting distance between themselves and the mad American, who'd turned their column into a wreck yard. Carpenter could let them go. He'd done enough. More than enough. But there was one more Panther and one more rocket, and the math was simple. He set up his final run, diving through the flak and tracers, ignoring the holes appearing in his wings, ignoring the temperature gauge redlining, ignoring everything except the target and the firing solution, and the toggle switch under his thumb. The sixth rocket left the launcher trailing fire and smoke. It flew true, struck the Panther's turret roof dead center, and ended the engagement. Carpenter pulled up, climbed to 2,000 feet, and turned for home. Behind him, 6 German tanks burned in the morning light. Below him, American soldiers emerged from their foxholes and stared upward at the fabric-covered Grasshopper, with its empty rocket tubes and its bullet-riddled wings. The teacher from Illinois had just changed the course of the battle at Aricourt. The Grasshopper limped through the sky like a wounded bird, fabric wings shredded, engine coughing intermittently, oil pressure gauge dancing in the red. Carpenter nursed the throttle, coaxing what remained of the Continental's 65 horses, trying to keep enough altitude to make it back to the airstrip. Below him, the battle continued. Sherman tanks engaging the scattered remnants of the Panzer column, artillery fire walking across the fields, infantry moving forward to consolidate positions. The Germans were pulling back, disorganized, their advance blunted by the American armor and by 6 well-placed rockets from an aircraft that had no business carrying them. But Carpenter wasn't thinking about victory. He was thinking about the temperature gauge that kept climbing, the smell of burning oil seeping into the cockpit, the way the stick felt loose in his hand, like something vital had disconnected. The airframe shuddered with each gust of wind, fabric flapping where machine gun rounds had torn through the wings and fuselage. He'd counted at least 40 holes on the way up. There were probably more he couldn't see. The airstrip appeared ahead, that blessed rectangle of trampled grass, with Morrison and his ground crew waiting beside the equipment shed. Carpenter began his approach, dropping through 800 feet, 600, fighting to keep the nose level as the engine sputtered and caught, sputtered and caught. The oil pressure was gone completely now. The temperature gauge pegged at maximum. He had maybe 2 minutes before something seized or melted or simply quit. 400 feet. The Grasshopper wallowed through the air, responding sluggishly to his inputs. He could see Morrison running toward the strip, waving his arms, probably cursing. The other pilots stood in a cluster near their own aircraft, watching. Word had already spread. The crazy major with the bazookas had taken on a Panzer column alone and somehow survived. They'd either pin a medal on him or ground him for recklessness. Maybe both. 200 feet. The engine coughed once, twice, then died completely. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream. Silence except for the wind singing through the bullet holes and the creaking of stressed metal. Carpenter pushed the nose down to maintain airspeed, trading what little altitude he had left for forward momentum. Dead stick landing in a shot-up Cub. Not how he'd planned to end the morning. 100 feet. The airstrip rushed up to meet him. He held the glide as long as he dared, then flared, pulling back on the stick, bleeding off speed. The Grasshopper settled, main wheels touching grass, tail wheel following a heartbeat later. The aircraft rolled maybe 50 yards before friction brought it to a stop. Carpenter sat in the cockpit, hands still on the stick and throttle, breathing hard. His shirt was soaked through with sweat. His legs trembled. The silence felt enormous after the noise of combat. No engine roar, no rocket ignition, no flak bursts or machine gun fire. Just the wind and the distant rumble of artillery and Morrison's boots pounding across the grass. Jesus Christ, Major. Morrison reached the aircraft, eyes scanning the damage. Jesus Christ. Carpenter unstrapped and climbed out, legs unsteady beneath him. The ground felt strange, too solid, too still. He walked around Rosie the rocketer, taking inventory. The wings looked like Swiss cheese, fabric torn in dozens of places, some holes big enough to put a fist through. The tail section had taken hits too, one round passing within inches of the elevator control cables. The engine cowling showed 3 distinct punctures. Oil dripped from somewhere underneath, forming a dark pool in the grass. "She's done," Morrison said flatly. "That engine's toast. Probably cracked the block. And the airframe's so shot up I don't even know where to start." "Can you fix her?" "Fix her?" Morrison laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "Major, I can patch fabric and replace cables. But this?" He gestured at the wreckage. "This needs a depot rebuild. New engine, new wing fabric, probably new control surfaces. We're talking weeks of work, and that's if I had the parts, which I don't." Carpenter nodded slowly, still looking at his aircraft. 6 empty rocket tubes hung beneath the wings, blackened from the backblast. The nose art was intact. Rosie in her bandana, still smiling, oblivious to the destruction around her. "How many did you get?" Morrison asked quietly. 6 tanks. Maybe 5 confirmed kills, 1 mobility kill. 6 tanks. Morrison shook his head. With 6 rockets, from a Grasshopper. He pulled out a cigarette, lit it, took a long drag. "The other pilots are saying you're either the bravest man in the Third Army or the craziest. Haven't decided which yet." "Neither have I." Other ground crew members approached, circling the damaged aircraft, pointing at the bullet holes, muttering among themselves. One of them, Private Kowalski, young kid from Detroit, reached out and touched one of the empty rocket tubes like it was a religious relic. "Is it true you dove on them?" Kowalski asked. "On the Panthers?" "Had to get close enough for the rockets to work," Carpenter said. "How close?" 300 feet. Sometimes less. Kowalski whistled low. "They teach you that in flight school?" "They taught me to spot artillery targets from 1,000 feet and stay out of trouble. The rest I figured out myself." Captain Andrew Miller walked across the airstrip, boots kicking up dust. Miller flew spotters too, but he'd refused to arm his aircraft, said it was suicide to take on tanks with bazookas. Looking at Rosie's condition, maybe he'd been right. "Carpenter." Miller stopped a few feet away, arms crossed. "You know they're going to court-martial you for this." "For what? Shooting down German tanks?" "For unauthorized engagement, for violating operational parameters, for reckless endangerment of government property." Miller gestured at the destroyed Grasshopper. "Take your pick." "I had authorization to mount the rockets." "You had authorization to mount them, not to use them like a goddamn fighter bomber." Miller's face was red, anger or concern, hard to tell. "You could have been killed. You should have been killed. Nobody attacks a Panzer column alone, nobody." Somebody had to slow them down. Clark's boys were exposed. That's what the artillery is for. That's what the Shermans are for. Not you. Miller stepped closer, voice dropping. You've got a wife and kid back home, don't you? What happens to them if you get yourself killed playing hero? The question hit harder than Carpenter wanted to admit. He thought about Elda, about Carol, about the promise he'd made to come home. But he also thought about the American soldiers in their foxholes, watching those Panthers roll toward them, knowing their Shermans were outgunned and outarmored. He thought about what would have happened if those 6 tanks had reached the front lines. I did what needed doing, Carpenter said. Yeah? Well, now you've done it. Miller pointed at Rosie. Your bird's wrecked. Even if Morrison could fix her, how long would that take? A month? 2? You're out of the fight, Carpenter. Hope it was worth it. Miller walked away, still shaking his head. Morrison dropped his cigarette and ground it under his boot. He's got a point, Morrison said. About the aircraft, anyway. She's not flying again anytime soon. Carpenter looked at the Grasshopper, at the empty rocket tubes, at the bullet holes. Morrison was right. Miller was right. He'd gambled everything on one mission and won the tactical battle, but lost his ability to keep fighting. Without Rosie, he was just another grounded pilot with nothing to do but watch the war continue without him. The sky overhead had cleared, morning sun burning through the last remnants of fog. Perfect flying weather. Perfect hunting weather. And here he stood, earthbound, his weapon destroyed. How long to patch her enough for one more mission? Carpenter asked. Morrison stared at him. You're not serious. One more mission. Just enough to get airborne, fire the rockets, land. Major, that engine is finished. It's not a question of patching. The block's cracked. It won't run. Then find me another engine. Where? You think I've got spare Continentals lying around? There's a war on, in case you hadn't noticed. Parts are allocated. Requisitions take weeks. Morrison pulled out another cigarette, hands shaking slightly as he lit it. Even if I could scrounge an engine, installing it would take days. Days you don't have, because intelligence says the Germans are bringing up more tanks, and when they do, you won't be ready. Carpenter knew Morrison was right, knew the whole thing was impossible. But standing there watching the other pilots prep their aircraft for afternoon missions, knowing the battle would continue and he couldn't participate, that was worse than getting shot down. At least getting shot down was quick. There are other L-4s, Carpenter said. Not with rocket mounts. That was custom work. Would take me a week to fabricate new brackets and run the wiring, and that's assuming I had the materials, which I don't. Morrison softened slightly, seeing the frustration on Carpenter's face. Look, Major, you did good work today. Real good work. 6 tanks is more than most pilots see in 6 months. Take the win. Let someone else carry the load for a while. But Carpenter couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left something unfinished. The Germans were still out there. More panzers, more brigades, more threats to Clark's exposed positions. One successful mission didn't win the battle. It just bought time. He walked away from the aircraft, away from Morrison and the ground crew, out to the edge of the airstrip where he could see the countryside spreading out below. Smoke rose from multiple points on the horizon. Burning tanks, burning vehicles, burning buildings. The price of war measured in fire and destruction. His hands still shook from the adrenaline. His ears still rang from the rocket launches and the flak bursts. But what he felt most was the absence. The lack of engine vibration, the missing weight of the stick in his palm, the silence where there should have been wind rush and propeller noise. Miller's words echoed in his head. You're out of the fight, Carpenter. Maybe so. But he'd made it count while it lasted. 6 German tanks would never reach Aricourt. 6 crews would never fire on American soldiers. That had to be enough, even if it didn't feel like enough. Even if every fiber of his being wanted to get back in the air and finish what he'd started. Carpenter stood at the edge of the airstrip, watching the battle unfold without him, and understood for the first time what defeat felt like, even in victory. The telegram arrived 3 days later, carried by a runner from division headquarters who looked too young to be in uniform. Carpenter stood in the equipment shed, helping Morrison inventory what salvageable parts could be stripped from Rosie before she was written off completely. The engine block had indeed cracked, a jagged fracture running through the cylinder casing that no amount of welding could fix. The airframe might be repairable, but without an engine, it was just an expensive glider. "Major Carpenter?" The runner saluted, holding out the envelope. "From General Wood's staff, sir." Carpenter wiped oil from his hands and took the telegram. The runner waited, probably expecting a reply, but Carpenter waved him off. The kid saluted again and left at a quick trot, boots splashing through puddles left by last night's rain. Morrison glanced up from the wing strut he was examining. "Good news or bad?" "Haven't opened it yet." Carpenter studied the envelope. Official seal, priority routing. Could be anything from a commendation to a court-martial summons. He tore it open and read. Morrison watched his face. "Well, they want me at division headquarters. Tomorrow morning, 0800 hours. That all it says? That's all it says. Carpenter folded the telegram and tucked it into his pocket. Guess I'll find out tomorrow. He didn't sleep much that night. Lay in his tent listening to the rain drum against the canvas, thinking about what the meeting might mean. Miller had been right about the unauthorized engagement angle. Technically, Carpenter had exceeded his mission parameters. The bazookas were approved for self-defense, not offensive operations against armor columns. A strict reading of regulations could land him in serious trouble. But he'd also knocked out 6 German tanks at a critical moment, possibly saving American lives, definitely disrupting the enemy's timetable. That had to count for something. Morning came gray and wet. Carpenter shaved with cold water from his helmet, put on his cleanest uniform, and caught a ride to division headquarters in a supply truck that smelled like diesel and cigarettes. The driver, a corporal from Georgia, kept glancing at him sideways. "You're the bazooka pilot, right?" the corporal finally asked. "That's what they're calling me?" "That's what everybody's calling you. Word is you took on a whole Panzer brigade by yourself. Killed 6 tanks in one sortie." 5 confirmed kills, Carpenter corrected. 1 mobility kill. Still. The corporal grinned. "That's something. My squad leader says you've got brass balls the size of church bells. Your squad leader has a colorful way with words. He's from Texas. They all talk like that." The corporal downshifted as they approached a checkpoint. "You in trouble? For the stunt, I mean." "Don't know yet. That's what I'm about to find out." Division headquarters occupied a commandeered chateau outside Nancy, its formal gardens now filled with tents and vehicles and radio antennas. Carpenter reported to the adjutant, a captain with rimless glasses who looked him up and down with barely concealed curiosity. "The general will see you shortly. Wait here." Carpenter waited in an anteroom that had probably been someone's library before the war. Books still lined the walls, French titles he couldn't read. A map table dominated the center of the room, covered with acetate overlays showing unit positions and enemy dispositions. The situation around Aricourt had stabilized. The German counteroffensive blunted, their tank strength reduced, American positions consolidating. "Major Carpenter." He turned. General John Wood stood in the doorway, stocky and solid, the kind of officer who looked like he belonged in a tank rather than behind a desk. Wood had commanded the 4th Armored Division since its activation, had led it across France with aggressive tactics that made Patton look cautious by comparison. Carpenter snapped to attention. "Sir." "At ease." Wood gestured toward the map table. "Come look at this." Carpenter approached. The general pointed to a section of the map marked with red symbols, indicating destroyed enemy armor. "Intelligence confirms 6 German tanks knocked out along this axis on the morning of September 20th, Wood said. Panthers and Panzer IVs, part of the 111th Panzer Brigade's advance element. Their column commander reported being attacked by American fighter bombers with rockets. Except we didn't have any fighter bombers in this sector that morning. Weather had grounded most of our tactical air support. No, sir, you didn't. What we did have was one L-4H Grasshopper armed with 6 bazookas and piloted by a history teacher from Illinois who apparently decided to take on a Panzer Brigade single-handed. Wood looked at him directly. That about sum it up? Yes, sir. Captain Miller filed a report saying you violated operational parameters. Reckless engagement, unauthorized tactics, endangerment of government property. Wood paused. He also said it was the bravest thing he'd ever seen, but he's still pissed you wrecked your aircraft. Carpenter said nothing. What could he say? Wood walked around the map table, hands clasped behind his back. I've been reading your file. Roosevelt Military Academy, Center College, teacher before the war. Got your civilian pilot's license in '39, flight instructor before Pearl Harbor. Commissioned as second lieutenant in '42, made major by '44. Good record. No disciplinary issues. I try to stay out of trouble, sir. And yet, here you are. Wood almost smiled. You know what the problem is with your stunt, Carpenter. It worked. If you'd missed those tanks, if you'd gotten yourself killed for nothing, I could discipline you cleanly. But you didn't miss. You stopped their advance cold, gave Clark's boys time to reposition, probably saved lives. Makes it hard to punish success. I understand, sir. Do you? Wood leaned against the map table. Because I'm not sure you do. What you did was tactically brilliant and strategically reckless. You can't build a doctrine around one pilot and one lucky mission. The Grasshopper isn't a fighter bomber. It's an observation platform. Start using them as tank hunters, and we'll lose pilots faster than we can replace them. I wasn't trying to create a doctrine, sir. I just saw an opportunity. And took it. Without backup, without air cover, without proper authorization. Wood straightened. Miller wants you grounded, says you're a liability. Half my staff agrees with him. Carpenter felt something sink in his chest. Here it came. The end of his flying career, probably a reprimand in his file, maybe worse. The other half? Wood continued. Thinks you're exactly the kind of innovative thinker we need. Aggressive, willing to improvise, unafraid to take risks when the situation demands it. He pulled a small box from his pocket and set it on the map table. General Patton heard about your mission, sent this with his compliments. Carpenter stared at the box. Distinguished Flying Cross. The medal sat on its bed of velvet, ribbon bright against the dark fabric. You're being decorated for exceptional heroism in aerial flight, Wood said. Your actions directly contributed to the successful defense of Aracourt and the defeat of German armored forces in this sector. The citation will reflect that. Sir, You're also being grounded. The words hung in the air between them. Carpenter nodded slowly. He'd expected this. Maybe even deserved it. Not as punishment, Wood clarified. Your aircraft is destroyed beyond field repair. Morrison says it would take weeks to get you another bird rigged with rockets, assuming we could spare the parts and the man-hours. We can't. The Lorraine campaign is entering a critical phase. I need my observation pilots doing what they're trained to do. Spotting targets, adjusting artillery, providing reconnaissance, not playing tank hunter. I understand, sir. I'm not sure you do. Wood picked up the metal box and held it out. This isn't just recognition, Carpenter. It's a message. To the other pilots, to the troops on the ground, to the Germans. It says we're willing to think differently, fight differently, win differently. You proved that a light observation aircraft with the right weapons and the right pilot can engage heavy armor and win. That matters. Not because we're going to arm every grasshopper with bazookas. We're not. But because it shows our people that innovation works, that courage matters, that one determined man can change the outcome of a battle. Carpenter took the box, feeling its weight in his palm. Lighter than he'd expected, heavier than he'd imagined. There's talk of reassigning you to training command, Wood said. Teaching new pilots your tactics, working with the ordnance people to develop better rocket mounts, maybe even testifying before the War Department about close air support. Interested? I'd rather stay here, sir, with my unit. Your unit doesn't have a spare aircraft for you. And frankly, after what you pulled, half the brass thinks you're too valuable to risk on daily missions. Wood smiled slightly. Sometimes the reward for doing something extraordinary is having people take away your chance to do it again. The irony wasn't lost on Carpenter. He'd wanted to do more than just observe, and he had. Now they were telling him to stop. Report to Morrison tomorrow, Wood said. Help him salvage what you can from your aircraft. After that, we'll see about reassignment. You've got a week to think about whether you want to go stateside or stay in theater doing staff work. Yes, sir. Dismissed, Major. And Carpenter? Sir. Good work. Truly exceptional work. The kind of thing they'll write about in history books someday. Wood's expression turned serious. Just don't do it again. We can't afford to lose people like you on glory runs. Carpenter saluted and left, the metal box in his pocket, feeling like he'd won and lost simultaneously. Outside, the rain had stopped. Weak sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating puddles that reflected the sky like scattered mirrors. The war would continue without him in the cockpit. Other pilots would fly the missions, spot the targets, call in the artillery. The Battle of Aricourt would be won or lost by tankers and infantrymen, not by one pilot with 6 rockets and more courage than sense. But for one morning in September, it had been his fight, and he'd won it. That would have to be enough. The Battle of Aricourt raged for another week after Carpenter's grounding. He spent those days in the equipment shed with Morrison, stripping useful components from Rosie the rocketer. Instruments that still worked, control cables that hadn't been shot through, sections of fabric that could be patched onto other aircraft. The fuselage became a skeleton, then a frame, then just scattered parts cataloged and stored for eventual reuse. By the time they finished, nothing remained of the aircraft that had killed 6 German tanks except the nose art, carefully cut away and rolled up for safekeeping. Shame to scrap her completely, Morrison said, running his hand over the empty engine mount. She earned better than this. She earned her retirement, Carpenter replied. More than most aircraft get. The ground crews had started calling him Bazooka Charlie. The nickname spread through the 4th Armored Division, then beyond. Soldiers he'd never met would recognize him in the chow line or at supply depots, ask him to sign their helmets or tell the story again. He kept the telling short. 6 tanks, 1 mission, 1 destroyed aircraft. The details felt private somehow, too immediate to share with strangers who wanted legends instead of truth. The Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony took place in a muddy field outside Nancy. Rain threatening, but holding off long enough for General Wood to pin the medal on Carpenter's chest, while a photographer from Stars and Stripes captured the moment. Other awards followed: Air Medal with clusters, Purple Heart for wounds sustained in aerial combat. The Purple Heart confused him until Morrison pointed out the shrapnel scars on his left forearm, small cuts he hadn't noticed during the mission, but which had bled enough to qualify. Captain Miller attended the ceremony, standing at the back of the small crowd. Afterward, he approached Carpenter, hand extended. "Congratulations, Major. You earned it." "Thank you, sir." They shook. "About your report." "Forget it. I was wrong. Still think your tactics were insane. But I was wrong about the results." Miller glanced at the medal. "You going stateside for training duty?" "Haven't decided yet." "Well, if you do, tell them to send us better rockets. The M6A3s work, but the launchers are garbage. Needs a proper mounting system, better electrical firing mechanism." Miller smiled slightly. "Maybe you started something here. Maybe not. Either way, it was worth watching." The reassignment orders came through on the last day of September. Carpenter could return to the States for training duty at Fort Sill, teaching artillery observation techniques and advising on air-ground coordination. Or he could stay in theater as a liaison officer, working between division headquarters and tactical air support units. Both options kept him out of the cockpit. He sat in his tent that night, Elda's most recent letter in his hands. She'd written about Carol learning to ride a bicycle, about the Victory Garden producing more tomatoes than they could eat, about how the house felt empty without him. The letter smelled faintly of her perfume, that floral scent he remembered from their last night together before shipping out. "Come home safe," she'd written. "That's all I ask. Come home safe and whole, and we'll figure out the rest together." Carpenter had promised to come back. He'd kept that promise so far, though it had been closer than Elda would ever know. 300 feet above a Panther with its gun traversing upward, tracers stitching the air around him, the Grasshopper bucking from rocket recoil. That was the razor's edge between keeping his promise and breaking it forever. He chose Fort Sill, chose home, chose teaching, chose the life he'd had before the war reached out and turned him into something else. The orders were cut within 48 hours. Before he left, Morrison gave him a package wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was the nose art from Rosie the Rocketer, carefully preserved, along with one of the empty bazooka tubes. "Figured you'd want something to remember her by," Morrison said. "And to prove to people it actually happened. Otherwise they'll think you made the whole thing up." "Thanks, Morrison, for everything. Just doing my job." The sergeant offered his hand. "You ever need a good ground crew, look me up after the war. I'll be the one running a garage somewhere, probably still cursing Continental engines." They shook, and Carpenter left Europe the way he'd arrived. In the belly of a transport plane, surrounded by other soldiers heading home for various reasons. Some were wounded, some had completed their tours, some were being rotated back for specialized training. None of them had attacked a Panzer brigade with 6 rockets and lived to tell about it. The crossing took 3 days. Carpenter spent most of it on deck, watching the Atlantic roll past, thinking about the missions he'd flown and the ones he'd never fly again. The war would continue without him. Already was continuing. The papers full of reports about Market Garden and the push toward Germany. Other pilots would fly observation missions. Other soldiers would fight the battles. His part was finished. Fort Sill felt strange after combat. Clean uniforms, hot showers, regular meals in mess halls that didn't smell like cordite and diesel. The instructors treated him with deference, the students with awe. He taught what he knew: artillery spotting, target identification, communication protocols, and tried not to think about how tame it all seemed compared to diving through flak at 300 feet. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. Carpenter learned about it during a training exercise, radio operator calling in the news over the command net. Victory in Europe Day. The students cheered. Carpenter felt only a quiet relief that it was over, followed by the realization that men he'd known were still over there, still fighting, still dying right up until the last minute. He received letters from some of them. Morrison, writing from Germany about the tanks they'd captured intact, the advanced armor the Germans had been developing toward the end. Captain Miller, describing the final push across the Rhine. Colonel Clark, brief and professional, thanking Carpenter for his service and his innovation. And one letter from a tank commander in the 4th Armored Division, a lieutenant who'd been at Aricourt that September morning. "We watched you come out of the sun with those rockets, watched you hit tank after tank while they tried to shoot you down. We were in our Shermans, hull down, waiting for them to close the range so we'd have a fighting chance. You bought us that chance. You stopped their advance before it started. Most of us in Combat Command A that day were alive because of what you did. Wanted you to know that." Carpenter kept that letter separate from the others, in the same box where he stored the nose art and the empty bazooka tube, evidence that it had mattered, that those 6 rockets fired from a fabric-covered observation plane had meant something beyond one pilot's desire to do more than watch. He returned to Moline in October, the war truly over now. Japan surrendered after the atomic bombs. Elda met him at the train station with Carol, who'd grown so much he barely recognized her. They drove home in silence, Carpenter's hand in Elda's, feeling the normalcy settle around him like a familiar coat. Teaching history felt different now. He stood in front of the same classrooms, talked about the same battles, but the words carried weight they hadn't before. When he discussed Gettysburg and Chancellorsville, he thought about decisions made in moments that mattered, about men who'd chosen to act when action seemed impossible. He never told his students about Aricourt, never mentioned the bazookas or the Panthers or the morning he'd turned a grasshopper into a tank hunter. It was enough to teach them to think critically, to understand that history was made by people who decided to do difficult things for reasons they believed were right. The doctors diagnosed him in 1945. Leukemia, aggressive, probably terminal. They gave him 2 years. He taught for 21 more, dying in 1966 at the age of 53, having outlived their predictions through sheer stubbornness and the same determination that had kept him flying through flak and tracer fire. His obituary mentioned his military service, but not the details. The Distinguished Flying Cross sat in a drawer with his other medals, rarely looked at, never displayed. The nose art from Rosie the Rocketer stayed in its box, along with the bazooka tube and the letters from men whose lives he'd saved. Decades later, researchers would identify the battered L-4H in an Austrian museum, trace its serial number back to that September morning in Lorraine, and begin the work of restoration. The aircraft would fly again, suspended in a museum gallery with its 6 bazooka tubes and its nose art restored by Carpenter's granddaughter. A permanent reminder that sometimes innovation and courage could change the outcome of a battle. But that was later, after Carpenter was gone, after the men who'd fought at Aricourt had become old or died, after the war had receded into history books and memorials. In the moment, in those final years teaching in Urbana, watching students learn to think critically about the past, going home to Elda and Carol and the normal life he'd promised to return to, Carpenter rarely thought about the 6 German tanks burning in a French field or the fabric-covered aircraft that had destroyed them. When he did think about it, usually late at night when the house was quiet and the memories surfaced unbidden, he remembered not the fear or the adrenaline or the acclaim that followed, but the simplest truth. He'd seen something that needed doing, and he'd done it. The teacher from Illinois who'd become Bazooka Charlie for one morning in September had kept his promise. He'd come home,